I'm Jeff Richards. I'm the secretary of the Friends of St. Nicholas Churchyard. I used to be chair until I was deposed in a friendly coup, but that's all right. I do most of the historical research into the church. If you ask me a question, typically I will say, "Ooh, that's really outside of my period," because what I really like is the high Middle Ages before the Reformation. And there are some walks and talks coming on in the summer where we'll explore some of the topics. Now, I know that a couple of you have been with me as I've led talks before, so that's very good that people have come back. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Jean. And thank you, anyone else who has heard me talk before. I am not a historian by training. So what you'll get from me, if I paraphrase Jane Austen, is an ignorant, partial and prejudiced view of history. But the joyous thing is that in St. Nicholas's history, which goes back to, well, one person would say it will go back to before 1086, which was the Domesday Book, because we're mentioned in Domesday Book. It could even go back to the 7th century and 675 AD, when Sutton, as an area of land, was gifted by Frithwald, the subregulus of Surrey, to the abbot of Chertsey as part of the foundation of that religious house. And it remained part of the abbot of Chertsey's domains all the way through until the Reformation in 1538, when Chertsey was closed and all of the estates were broken up, and that's when we started to get the involvement of the Carew family, who are the great landowners across this area. I'll touch on some of the historical background for each of these figures, but you can understand that in our history there have been a lot of named priests. The first named priest is in the 13th century, a guy called Nicholas de Heddershorn. Heddershorn, you can actually see the lists of rectors and vicars in the church porch when you go out, and you can check anything that I'm saying against that. But in the dozens of vicars and priests who have been associated with St. Nick's, this church, it's been fun to discover at least 10 who have at various times been able to be described, well, if not the Messiah, very naughty boys, okay? And we will see some of the stories associated with them. I have to say that this, please be aware that I'm going to be touching on things and I don't want to upset anyone. The good news is that there isn't anything that I think, would consider completely inappropriate in the stories that I'm going to tell. Most of this is to do with politics and getting into trouble with authority, which is a good thing from a Christian perspective, that you don't necessarily want to get into trouble. But the first guy I want to talk about is William Morland. Now, in the editing of this online thing, I will actually put an illustration up. But if I can hand that out and we can do a loop of, get a sense of who William Morland was. William was a character linked to Sutton during the period of the Wars of the Roses. So William Morland was part of the extended bastard feudal retinue and affinity of the the Neville family, these great northern landowners. The Nevilles, coming up from Northumbria, had land holdings, and the there were two people who came south during the rise of the Neville family, and they were the Morland family and the Kellett family. You'll see those appear, and I'm going to talk about there's a talk later on that I want to make about these two priests, because they're instrumental in the shape of the English language which we have today. Their rise was in the generations just following the move of the courts to stop using French and Latin and to start using English. And as judgments came out, those judgments had to be in a standardized English, which started to be in the form of Chancery English. So anyway, so as the Neville family are rising up and they're becoming more influential in court, they are placing people who have kinship and affinity and feudal ties with them in this period where feudalism is breaking down and money and livery is starting to be more important. They're starting to place these people they're patronizing in important places. And priests were part of that network, because priests were employed by the king and the royal family as lawyers. And it was a cheap way of doing that, because if you got a priest who is a lawyer, you don't have to pay them. You can give them land in which they will receive the tithes. And this is called the living. So you're able, if the king, through his influence, grabbed a chunk of land, you could say, right, you're going to serve in this bit. So the Morland and Kelletts came down as a job lot of these Neville placements, and they worked their way up through the courts of Chancery until, during this whole confused period of the Wars of the Roses, when you had the Yorkists and the Lancaster battling it out, and in this particular reign you had you had Henry VI being quite well unable to rule, being ousted by Edward. And then there's this period in which there is the readeption of Henry VI, leading on then until the final battles, and where actually the Yorkists are then in control. It's this period that the Nevilles are rising up, and you might have heard of the Earl of Warwick, who is the leading Neville, being called the Kingmaker. And if you are going to control things, then you want to make sure that in your control, you can control the archives. And so William Morland was very useful, because he was the master of the rolls. You can control the archives, you can control the records that were, and if you can control the records that were, you can decide the future. And that came into play most prominently, those of you who know Richard III. So Richard III was the king who is allegedly deposed his nephews, who were the children of the previous king, Edward, but the children of Elizabeth Woodville, and they disappeared into the Tower and they were killed. The essential thing is that they had to be declared bastards. If they were declared bastards and the marriage with Elizabeth Woodville illegitimate, then they weren't in the line of succession. And that's what Richard was able to do. And the person who was able to do that, well, controlled the civil service, who controlled the rolls. And that's William Morland. And what happened to William Morland? Well, his world started to come crashing down on the field of battle at Bosworth. And so when Henry Tudor came in, there was a sweeping away. Now, luckily, he didn't lose his head because he was a priest. He was immune from that sort of swift and rather merciless retribution. But let's say he was forced to retire. He was no longer master of the rolls. William Kellett was lucky to keep this job as well as his number two as well. Now, there's more to tell more about them. I want to introduce you to people called Henry Monkey, his servant who got into trouble and all sorts of things like that. But I'll tell that maybe another talk later on. Okay, so that's our first run into trouble, who was something of a minor gamer within the history. The second person I want to talk to you is about as a guy who is, well, Henry the Seventh, Henry Tudor, beats Richard III in battle, seizes the throne, marries Elizabeth of York, and starts a new dynasty, the Tudor dynasty. And who was Henry the Seventh's son? Henry VIII, okay. And Henry VIII had, if you think about the Wars of the Roses, if anything, was a problem of one part of the family having just too many children, so they would then argue, okay? So that was a problem of hyperfertility. In the case of Henry VIII, it didn't help that he was charitably firing blanks a lot of the time. So he had a problem of securing his succession by creating a valid male heir and enter in the negotiations to annul the marriage between Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. So if you're going to annul something, you need to have an ambassador. And I mentioned that Sutton was this place that was a very useful thing for the king to be able to appoint people as lawyers in his service to the living. So it was nearly all the medieval period. We've got people who are sergeants at law. They are something in the courts. They are doing the king's bidding, making state function. By the High Middle Ages, you've got the wealth of this area, and it's difficult to, Sutton is overshadowed because it wasn't where the manorial courts were. You got overshadowed by places like Ewell and Cheam and obviously Carshalton, and then across there. That's where the water was. What was here was sheep, and sheep was the wealth of England. Those of us with living memories remember the Chancellor of England sitting on a woolsack to demonstrate the wealth and power. And so it was a good deal to be able to get a living here because you got all that portable wealth given to you as 1/10 of the product of this parish. A lot of money, and it was used then for a series of ambassadors who were all legal lawyers who were sent to the court, either in the end of Henry VII's reign or in Henry VIII's reign. So before this chap that we're talking about, which is William Bennet, there was a guy called William Grigg. And they were all, this is talking about people being poisoned in Rome, left, right and centre, daggers being hidden in crucifixes. If you've played the game Assassin's Creed, the one set in this period, it's exactly like that. So his is a high stakes game. Now, he was a loyal king's servant, but he was ineffectual. He wasn't able to get the Pope to agree. And it had to change in the way that his job changed from getting the Pope to agree to starting to hide what Henry VIII was doing, because it was building up to this period of time which is known as the restraint of appeals, which passed a law in Parliament to say that there should be absolutely no passing out to the Rome any decisions about marriage or anything like that. No appeal to the bishop in Rome when you've got bishops who are able to make that decision in England. This is the concept that Henry was looking at in the development of the concept that England was an empire. It had its own ability to make decisions for itself. Now, William Bennet, the reason I've included him here is not because he got into absolute trouble, but let's say Henry wasn't best pleased with him. He wrote him a howler of a letter, calling him and others who were working for him in Rome as Englishmen papisticate. He thought that they were going native and they were not focused on his needs. Let's say when he was finally recalled from Rome back home, and he had spent a lot of time moving backwards and forwards, he ended up dying when he got to Piedmont. So he died, he fell ill, he was worn out. But frankly, I've included him in the list because I think he would have probably ended up in big poo with Henry VIII when he got home. Because he didn't do what Henry wanted, and Henry was not by then above disposing of people who he felt had wronged him. Now, this obviously opens up the whole of the Reformation, which in England is a bit of a strange thing because it isn't a sudden break, it's a series of gates that you pass through until one day you realize, oh, we're a Protestant nation, we're no longer a Catholic nation. And this is where I want to introduce another character called Miles Braithwaite. Now, Miles Braithwaite is included here because, if you like, he lived and worked a little bit too long. And it shows how people can end up getting into big trouble just because they tried to bend with the wind and found that the wind changes direction. And so Miles Braithwaite was a very talented, very well qualified person. Remember, you're seeing that we're talking about lawyers all the way through. Lawyers, people, this is a place that you want to put somebody because there's a lot of wealth in here. It's a way of rewarding them. And so he's an academic. He's been a principal of St. Edmund's Hall in Oxford. So he eventually, as the Reformation is starting to shape up, as the restraint of appeals, he's appointed, first of all, well, he comes into Banstead as a rector, then into Carshalton, and then into Sutton. So he comes to Sutton. And it's at this time, he predates the coming of the Carews in 1538, because he's around here in 1834, 1836. But he's very much seen as part of that family affinity. And so it doesn't work well with him, of course, when you get into problems with the Carews, but he's here as nonsuch is being built. And he's a useful theologian to have around. And he is a proper theologian. He's very, very well qualified, very academic. But as Henry VIII dies, and you get into the problem of Edward coming onto the throne, and they're reorganizing the church. He appears in the registers as buying church fabric, buying the stuff that the assessors are coming in as the Protestant Reformation kicks in. So he's buying altar cloths. What he's going to do with them, I don't know. but he buys them probably to preserve them and keep them. There's a whole thing about he living through this period when the churches are being stripped. But it gets to the point when, of course, Bloody Mary comes to the throne. You have the whole period of the Catherine Jane Grey. And I suspect that part of the reason is that he left the building there were a series of politicking around that period, and he probably had backed on the wrong horse. He probably had sworn allegiance to Lady Jane Grey, and that creating the grounds for Mary to dismiss him and deprive him of the living. And that really brings us on to one of my favourite characters, Edmund Marvin. Now, Edmund Marvin, and here obviously we've got a very, very odd looking hat that he's wearing. He's a Norbertine canon. Canons are priests who live their lives outside of the monastery. They are priests and they're supposed to be living out in the community. And he's an interesting guy because, first of all, he appears in records as something of an academic troublemaker. He is very much in the new learning. So he's a Renaissance man. He likes the academic freedom. He likes the whole, why do we do this in the old scholarship way? He's attacking people where he is a student and basically causing trouble as he's teaching, to the point where Archbishop Cranmer has him brought to his attention. So this is when he's obviously a fairly junior priest, and Cranmer, implementing the Protestant Reformation, sees him as somebody who is, I don't mind, he's okay. I don't have to worry about him. But actually what happened is that once Mary was in, he flipped and he became essentially, he was appointed as Archdeacon of Surrey. Now, archdeacons politely, I'm an Archdeacon Moira, who looks after the parishes in Sutton. I've joked with her is that she is the enforcer of Lord God. The job of the Archdeacon is to carry out visitations on behalf of the bishop to make sure everything is in order. It's a scary thing for church wardens that you have to have everything in order because the Archdeacon is coming. And there were disputes. So you'd have basically riots. There'd be so much distress about an Archdeacon's visitation that people could have all sorts of ructions. There was one in Carshalton. But he's the person who is responsible for finding out heretics. He's the person, in other contexts, in other places, if you've heard of Mayfield, if you've heard of Lewis, that's where the heretics were burnt at the stake. Now, I've not been able to put blood on Edmund's hands, but let's say I've included him here because, frankly, no one thought that he was a nice guy. He enforced Bloody Mary's rule. He reversed the effects of the Reformation, and when Elizabeth came in, he refused to sign the act. He refused to assent to the Act of Succession and Supremacy, and so he was deprived of his living. And some of the research that I've done shows that he, like William Morland, would have brought family with him. Those people, we're getting into the early modern period here, but the medieval period works on the basis that if one person rises, you have an affinity around your family who are your dependents, and they're your kin, and they tend to follow you around as you rise, because they're the only people that you can rely on. Poor old Edmund Marvin when he was deprived, we get a sense that there were Marvins still around, and there's a record. There's one. I found one rather pathetic record of an old lady some years later in Elizabeth's reign begging, indicating that his family had really completely been ruined by the change in religious policies. Okay. Now, if we step on, you remember when I was talking about how I've shown you how we've got people who are troublemakers, but they were troublemakers because they were so learned, they were so academic, they were high flyers. Whether that's William Morland, I will make it legal, channeling there Emperor Palpatine, or whether it was somebody like William Bennett, the papal ambassador, whether it was people before him, William Gregg, and all these people that you'll see on that board, until you get to this guy, Henry Parry. And Henry Parry is appointed to Sutton. And so Henry Parry is, well, we don't know why he was deprived. We don't absolutely know. So he comes in Elizabeth's reign. So he's 1560, and he's deprived then in 1568. So he manages to go for 6 years. There are several reasons why Elizabethan clergy are thrown out. Do they refuse to conform to the religious settlement? No, that's not going to be that. And he must have accepted that in order to get the job. Would it be non-conformity in religious practices? Possibly, because what you've got here are the creepings in of much more of a rise of Calvinistic Anglicanism, which we would then identify as Puritanism. So you could be that. Could be that. Could be his marital status. He fell foul of that because Elizabeth seems to have changed policy a few times on whether she allowed priests to marry or not. It could be moral misconduct, but there's not a whiff of that. But I think the thing that he probably fell down, this is a personal thing, is that so many people had been culled out of the English church through the period of the Reformation and all through this period. I think he was appointed somewhere that he just couldn't hack. I really think that he fell down on the idea of the proper qualifications. Now, those qualifications could he demonstrate that he had actually been properly ordained in the turmoil, whether he was properly educated, whether he had completed his degree, whether he had obtained that fraudulently, I don't know. But there was so much turmoil during the Elizabethan period around the church that I suspect that is one of the underlying reasons. And like anything I'll say is more research is necessary to conclude on that. Now, I brought up the question of Puritanism, and I want to now bring on our next character, Jos Glover. Now, Jos Glover is a unique amongst all of these characters in that he is mentioned on the red plaque. He's mentioned on the red plaque that is outside the church. Only there, his name is erroneously, I like that word, erroneously given as Joseph Glover. Now, I know from looking at records, church records, that he wasn't Joseph Glover, because in Latin his name is given as Jocardus Glover, and Jocardus is the Latin name for a Flemish saint called Saint Jos. So his name was Jos, and he had a lot of links with the Netherlands. And this is where we are going to start to see a rise in what's involved at this point. Now, Jos Glover, I should say, he's really the product of this network of people who, through the Reformation, spent half their lives on the continent, either in the Catholic towns of the Low Countries or in the Protestant Calvinistic towns of the Low Countries. And the family that Jos Glover came from were wealthy merchants, and he married other wealthy merchant and landowner countries, and they tended to be, in the mercantile classes, they tended to favour Puritanism, this idea that they were developing that the righteous would prosper, and so if you were prospering, you must be righteous. Yeah. It's a slightly absurd logic, but it is a very attractive logic to a lot of people. So Jos Glover, and if you want to know, he was very, very successful. He was very educated. He was very diligent. He worked very hard, and he was rector here for about 10 years. His first wife has a monument, Sarah Oldfield, has a monument here in St. Nick's, had several children with her. She's in the broom cupboard. Why St. Nick's puts important monuments in broom cupboards, I don't know. But no one here did it. It's a historic wrong. But we put several important monuments in this. One of the probably later on, I'll come to mention the fact that there's another important monument inside the organ as well, hidden. But I don't want to go on to that particular squirrel. I'm going to stick to my talk that I'm going on here. But Jos Glover was very much tied into a family that was trading, and in the 17th century, the trade that they were involved in took them to the Caribbean. So this is the start of the period in which you've got the first plantations in islands like Barbados, and the creation of the colonies there, and the exploitation of sugar and the transportation of slaves. So he's there in that family setting, and they're also exploring the idea of creating a new, escaping from the sinful confines of England to a new world that was a blank canvas in which a new, more perfect Jerusalem could be explored and found. And their family, both the Oldfield, his first wife, and the Glovers, his family, were investors in the Massachusetts Bay Company. So he went across several times, and things were coming to a head. The reason for this is that he felt the Lauderian reforms of the Church of England, which was bringing back, instead of a sense of Protestant reformed religion in the form of Calvinist, the Lauderians, the Archbishop Laud, were very much more on the idea of Arminianism, which is that you're participating in the salvation that comes entirely from God. The idea that there is not this sense of our total corruption, but that there is something good in you that can be rescued, and that you can be aware of that so you can turn to God. So you've got, and also he's very much in hostility towards the rise of the influence of the king in dictating things. And there's this strange thing that James I had published called the King's Book of Sports. Now, the King's Book of Sports talks about the discipline of all the subjects on Sunday activities. And the King's Book of Sports was a sermon that said it was okay to play games on a Sunday after you have been to church. Okay? Your first duty, go to church, and then you can knock a ball around. You can do archery. You can do what you feel like, as long as it's legal. And the Puritans really objected to this because they wanted the whole Sabbath, the whole Sunday devoted only and wholly and exclusively to God. Yet the king is saying, use it for recreation, use it for you. The Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So it comes to a head during this period where he, in 1636-ish, he just buggers off because he's refusing to read the King's Book, and the wardens are going, oh no, and even his Lord of the Manor, the Darcy family, I think by that time, are apologising to the bishop and anyone that they can apologise to. He just disappeared. He just disappeared. And what he had done is he had taken his new wife, an apprentice, a printing press, and headed over to Massachusetts. Now, he died on the voyage. So he didn't get to America, not this trip. He didn't get to America, but his printing press did. And his printing press is the start of the Cambridge Press, which is part of Harvard. So it was part of the foundation of really that printing in and the cultural development in America. So you can blame Hollywood on Sutton. Oh, there you go. I'll let you think that through, because ultimately it is all that sense of movement came from Sutton and his desire to go across and create a new one. One of the things I'm really upset about is that we lost the opportunity of getting one of the first book of Psalms that was printed on that press, called the Day Book of Psalms. Day Book of Psalms sells for millions of dollars if you get a copy. And it's a shame that St. Nick's never got one sent back to him. Okay. The next person is I want to talk about is a guy called Jeremiah Oakley. Now, the Jeremiah Oakley, if we can get through the turmoil of the English Civil War, we come to a point in which there's much more of a bedding down. Oh, sorry. Before I go on to Jeremiah Oakley, can I bring your attention back, because I've just realised I want to give you an epitaph of exactly what the character, the divisive nature of Jos Glover was like, and it's a wonderful one. The Civil War was the whole period of the Civil War. Most of the 17th century was where Sutton had a single rector called Henry Witch. Brilliant man. But he wrote this: Henry Witch, being a non-regent Master of Arts in the University of Cambridge, was inducted by Thomas Pope into the rectory of Sutton on the 10th of June in the year of our Lord, 1636, after a resignation made of the same rectory by Jos Glover, who was much beloved of the most, if not all, and his departure much lamented by the most, if not all. So you've got a sense there that Jos Glover was not what you would call a unifier in that, because that's, if you decode that in Anglican terms, let's say, wasn't best liked by everyone. But Jeremiah Oakley, he's in this period where we've gone through the whole of the Stuart. We're going through, if Jos Glover was in Charles I's reign, we have the Civil War, where Henry Witch, and Henry Witch, if you want to find where Henry Witch was the rector during that period, his tomb is over there. Comes in, Charles II's restoration comes in, and then you've got the problem that James comes to the throne after the death of Charles II. James II, of course, was Catholic. Big problem, because the whole thing is that this is the Anglican Church. It is now a Protestant church, mostly Calvinistic. James doesn't want to interfere with anyone's religion. He says he doesn't want to interfere with that, but eventually he was getting to the point where people were starting to raise aware of the political dimensions of really this papal influence within the country, embroiled in all sorts of wars and succession issues. So you might have heard of the 7 Divines, who were the bishops who made representation to call and invite William of Orange and his wife Mary, who was the daughter of Charles II Protestant, and therefore the niece of James, to come over and receive the throne. So this is the idea that Parliament would decide where the succession lay. And it was the upshot was that James came in. It wasn't a bloodless revolution. There were battles, there were Dutch troops marching through London. It was an invasion, but the fiction is that, and William didn't want to have, was that this was his right to the throne was not through conquest. His right to the throne was that James, he had come on a visit, and James had reacted badly and abdicated, which is true. He'd come to a visit with Dutch troops sailing up and warships sailing up the Thames, and James didn't have a leg to stand on, and so pushed off to France and then to Ireland. In the meantime, he made the mistake of he threw the Great Seal of State into the Thames, which really was one of the arguments. You could say he had abdicated. He had ended his role by throwing that away. Those people who could not, in conscience, while James was still alive, swear a second oath to another king, because he was still king, anointed by God, were called the non-jurors. And you cannot have that tension of people who they might accept the fact that you are regent, ruling, but you can't. And they might accept theologically that James is a bad un, but I've sworn to be his servant. And Jeremiah Oakley was that person. I'm a reader in the Church of England. I had to swear that I would give service to Her Majesty the Queen and her heirs and successors. And so that's my role into that. If I was to say, oh, no, I'm going to give it to somebody else, that would have been in exactly the same. What's my moral position there? So Jeremiah Oakley found himself plunged into this position of illegality, not because he was bad. It's because he believed his words should stay. And I feel very sorry for him, because he was a good person who had been here for 8 years and had obviously made an impression, and his family goes on in this area as well. He had come from this area, he lives in this area, and he's got family, all that. It's a shame. Now he gets replaced, or followed, I should say, by another interesting character. Because by this time, politics are dominated by those people who are for the establishment and get the name applied to them as the Tories, and those people who are much more in favour of free trade, not the land, not farming, not agriculture, but trade and outward looking and dynamism and much more Protestant-y rather than Catholic-y side of things. And they were the Whigs. So you might have heard of that division between the Whigs and the Tories. Well, the next person who comes up is in this period where the division is really high. This, by the way, is actually Titus Oates standing in the stocks. It's not our guy William Stevens, but he wrote really cheerful sermons and was a prodigious author. I got sermons on several subjects, and they are cracking reads in 2 volumes. This is volume 1. This is only volume 1, so it is. Yeah, goodness, it is. Sermons. Search for the scriptures, in them you think you have eternal life. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 sermons just on John, Gospel of John, chapter 5, verse 39. Okay, so he's full on. He's really prodigious in being able to deliver stuff, and he does things like a second. This is fantastic one. Cracking one in 1714. A second deliverance from popery and slavery, as it was set forth in a sermon in the parish church of Sutton in Surrey, being the first Sunday after His Majesty's landing. Majesty's landing, there was King Billy, or Dutch William of Orange. So you've got these blasts. And he's cracking ones about how horrid the Irish are to Protestant settlers. He's really what you call today, he'd be biting the carpet and writing exclusively in green ink. Okay, so I think that he's that level of political zeal. He gets into trouble. Because although he is seen as somebody who is an entertaining speaker, and he has someone who's broadly, a lot of people agree with him, he gets into trouble in the context of Queen Anne's reign, who's the sister of Mary and who inherited the succession from her. He gets into trouble because of all of the continental campaigns that are going on. He gets into trouble when he starts to preach sermons or give lead prayers, and he excludes the prayers for the royal family. So he prays it with Parliament, and he excludes those prayers. So he's sanctioned. He changes English law to say that you have to have a certain level of qualification and to be at least a dean to be able to do that. He also criticizes a number of pamphlets about the government, which ends up being prosecuted for seditious libel and being sentenced to stand twice in the pillory, 2 separate places, one Charing Cross and I can't remember off the top of my head, and pay 100 marks. So a huge fine, and to be pelted with rubbish in 2 separate places. Now, eventually, he's excused that, but the fact remains, William Stevens was a man who didn't care what anyone thought, and eventually he paid a little price for that by being sentenced to stand in the pillory. I think he would be quite a prickly person to have as a rector. Another sign of his character is that one of his daughters married somebody he disapproved of, and so he left her 1 shilling in his will. Anyway, don't cross swords with William Stevens. I'm going to move on now to we're coming into the Victorian period, and the person I want to talk about next. In my notes, I have just left blank. I've got notes here, and I've got bullet points, bullet points, bullet points, bullet points. But the Hatch family. The Hatch family is something else. Now, I think I'm going to need to talk about the Hatch family another time, more fully. The Hatch family starts their rise in Sutton through a guy called Giles Hatch. He becomes rector, and so Giles Hatch becomes rector in, reminding myself of when he appeared. So he comes in 1831. So he's in the Georgian period. And by that time, the lord of the manor has been sold. The family, the Mason family, who had been in control during Jeremiah Oakley's period of time, because of deaths, because of changing politics, because it was only daughters within the family, they shifted the attention away. And the property was sold by one of the daughters to a Captain Cliff, who was a former East India captain. So you've got this rise of the mercantile power. It's very much the story of the rise of empire and how tradespeople started to have the wealth, the disposable money. And they wanted to then create a legacy for themselves by securing basically a status. Land provides, still in a Tory world, land provided the status. So if you became the lord of the manor, you had a piece of land to say, this is where I come from. You put roots down. And eventually, though, that family started, the Cliff family, and ran into problems. They were declared bankrupt, or at least, by the death. You don't have necessarily declared bankrupt. They run into financial problems. It looks like Giles Hatch, who had been appointed by the family, had an eligible son, Thomas, and he engineered that Thomas marry the heiress to the manor. So he managed to get hold of, with that, he managed to get hold of, for his child, both the living for the rectory and also the manor for the child. So it's this rise of squireocracy, where you've got the choir and the squire, both being the rector and. So this is really not, it's a bit sleazy here. I think it is something fundamentally wrong on using that manipulation. The family goes on to being this, the Hatch family goes on to become, Thomas Hatch goes on to become a vicar in Walton. He has a brother, Henry, who is something of a waste of space. Yeah. I could be even worse than that, because he's a Cambridge man. Henry is a Cambridge man. He's then given That's because he seems to be so completely ruined. He has married, he has children, but supposedly for an Anglican priest, he hasn't actually bothered to get them baptized. But his brother, not knowing what on earth to do with him, gives him the living of Sutton. So he comes to Sutton, Henry Hatch, and he proceeds to hurriedly get his children privately baptized, so he conforms to church discipline. He then seems to have run a carriage on what money, we don't know. He seems to have gouged the inhabitants by basically upping the fees for burials and church services. So he was exploiting his position, and this is all in the 1830s. But by the time, what happens is that the advowson, the gift of being the rector, is separated from the lord of the manor. So somebody else comes in, guy, top of my head, I can't remember his name, but he comes in and basically he's the one who'll come through, break up the Turnpike Trust, create the railways and start to develop Sutton in the 1840s. So you have this modernizing force coming in. At the same time, you've got the Hatch family, Henry Hatch, who is just this monument to self-indulgence and the worst aspects of really entitlement. And he mortgages the glebe lands. He ruins really the finances of St. Nicholas Church for gambling debts and things. And eventually action is taken from him and it's sequestered and a series of curates are installed. You've got a former rector of Carshalton coming in here and actually having to do the services. You do have the family, the Hatch family elsewhere, trying to come in and help. So you have another Henry Hatch, who's his nephew, coming in. But frankly, the family is so awful. There have been books written about how rubbish the Hatch family are. Because Henry Hatch Jr. might have been the first priest or chaplain of one of the new Pantechnicon jails, but he found himself in trouble for basically fiddling with little girls. And then he compounded everything by suing the little girls for being false witnesses. Not nice in my book. And Henry the Hatch Senior, his uncle, our rector, eventually stayed and is still styling himself as rector of Sutton to give him status, even though the income had been sequestered by the bishop, so he can't have that. Went on to basically die in poverty. His daughters had gone out to India but to basically find husbands, because they could not in this country. He'd managed to ruin himself. Now I wonder, we are 9 down, so we've got one person to come. This is, and that is the portrait of John Allen Giles. So John Allen Giles is this rector of Sutton who is rector in 1867 to 1885. So he's the rector who came in when this church was built in 1864. We have a description from 1880, his time. I want to see if I can find this to share this with you. Ah, yes, the service. To give you a sense of people liked, while he was vicar here, people liked him. The service of public worship, as now conducted, is choral, hearty, and in decided contrast with that prevailing until recently in this, as in most other rural parishes. Still being described as a rural parish in 1880, but you're talking about people who are enjoying coming to church, lots of noise, lots of singing. And from what I can gather, he was not only a lovely man, but he was also a hugely gifted academic man, prolific author, teacher, writer, and contributing of international literary works, including one by a big French survey of a Frenchman who did a Latin survey of all of the early church fathers of the Western Church. So John Allen Giles is writing that. He was headmaster of St. Paul's, I think. Wasn't particularly effective administrator, but he did no wrong, except when he was in Oxford Diocese. This is what done him, is that he'd made the mistake of helping his servant and her lover get married. They married against the wishes of the man's master, because he was still an apprentice, and he married them without proper banns, outside of the ecclesiastical hours. And although his bishop spoke up for him, the Bishop of Oxford, he was sentenced, I think, for 6 months and eventually served 3 before he was released. So a good man who tried to help, but because he broke the law, he went to prison. So that's the last person that is in my survey of the 10 out of the many dozens of priests in Sutton who have ended foul of authority and the law. So some of them, you might agree with me, are dirty, rotten scoundrels, but not all of them. And my final thing that I'll say is, if you're wondering if there's a legacy for Henry Hatch, there is a Hatch family tomb out in the churchyard, but I like to think that if you walk up Christchurch Park in Sutton, and you turn around and you walk past to a new build of 1960s buildings, people would have thought, oh, who was the rector 100 years ago? Let's name something after him. There it is, Henry Hatch Court. I'm wondering, do they know? Do they really know? Had they done their homework? Is it the girl fiddling Henry Hatch? Or is it the crooked, gouging Henry Hatch? Let that rest with us now. Thank you very much. Thank you.